afterwards, we'll get into the meat of the event, so to speak, with Professor Kalt, our guest speaker. So with that, Professor Berman, show's yours.
Oh, I'm grateful I was invited because when I eventually get prosecuted for all the felonies that I surely commit on a regular basis, in part because felony law is so broad and big, I want to be able to still dodge jury duty rather than just be excluded from it completely. Bad jokes aside, I'm very grateful to Mon for inviting me to come, and I'm very disappointed I have to run off to a faculty meeting in a matter of minutes, not only because the food here is better, but also because this is a much more important and valuable conversation, not only because by virtue of its sponsorship by the Federalist Society and having Brian here, it's itself a reminder that those committed to the structural and foundational principles of the Federalist Society prides itself on should be thinking really hard about these kinds of issues. And for me, what I want to define as these kinds of issues is who we exclude categorically from things that we think are not only part of citizenship, but in many respects from a founding era were essential parts of citizenship. So in fact, I'm busy wrapping up edits on an article about how much the framers loved juries, and it's something that's been a big part of recent sentencing law scholarship and discussion, and so I'm a big fan of juries. I'm also a big fan of felons. Not only because without felons, I wouldn't have a career, right? There's not much criminal law if nobody commits serious crimes, but also because a lot of my best friends are felons. That's a little bit of an overstatement. But what it is an assertion of the reality that the modern terminology, felon, is overdefined and underdefined in a variety of ways, especially from a sort of framer's perspective. Overdefined or overexpansive in the sense that so many more things are felonies these days than ever have been. To a large extent, and those of you who remember criminal law or were lucky enough to have it with somebody besides me so that you focused on this distinction, we talk a lot, or at least common law talks about the difference between malum in se crimes, things that are obviously wrong in themselves, and malum prohibitum crimes, things that are wrong only because we've decided to prohibit them. Not only at common law were there no malum prohibitum felonies, but even if it's something that was wrong in itself, malum in se, it wouldn't always be a felony, in part because felonies usually were death penalty offenses or at least super serious offenses. We use the term felon, or at least my sense of the history is the term felon describes somebody who did something really seriously, really wrong, really harmful to the community, or really threatening, in a way that perhaps made a lot of sense, that we excluded that person from lots of the parts of citizenship. In fact, we often excluded that person from citizenship completely, banishment, very common, or excluded them from life, the death penalty, very common. That's obviously not where we are today. We don't use death or banishment as a common punishment for anything but the most ridiculously severe crimes, and even more importantly, and I think this is the more important thing, because of that, we've expanded what are felonies to be basically anything we really think is serious. Put it differently, whereas in the past the felony misdemeanor distinction was a very good distinction between really serious crimes and not so serious crimes. Now it's all crimes we really give a damn about are felonies, and everything else, which we probably even shouldn't be worrying about through the criminal law, get to be called misdemeanors, and that's a broad overstatement, but it's one of the reasons why, when we think about the category felon, I encourage you to think to yourself, am I imagining somebody with an ounce of pot who would be a felon in federal law? I think, although that might be a little bit overbroad. Certainly a felon in most states, save California, I think. Somebody who's been convicted of a single drunk driving offense at a certain level of BAC. Or somebody who put the wrong environmentally unsound containers around a bunch of lobsters. That's the sort of classic white-collar case these days, being promoted for over-criminalization at the federal level. And so understanding that the term felon isn't only the John Wayne Gacy's and Unabombers of the world, but a lot more people, is important as you start this. In addition, and again, this is the other piece of this, there are a lot of us, whether we'll admit it to ourselves or not, who probably technically commit felonies but never get either caught or prosecuted, because we know the term felony and the law is drawn in extraordinarily broad ways. There is prosecutorial discretion, that's a good thing. There's police discretion, there is judicial discretion, etc., etc., etc. But I do think it's accurate to fear, not necessarily assume, but fear, or justified to fear, that those who get the label legally a felon are not only more than the common law would have branded as felon, but are, if not socioeconomically inherently disadvantaged, at least subject to the back end of the legal system for a variety of reasons that itself contributes to them being a felon. And the reason I emphasize these points is because there are so many collateral consequences, besides jury service, besides deportation, that got all the way up to the Supreme Court last year, besides an issue I've focused on, which is making it a crime for you to exercise your Second Amendment rights to keep and possess a gun, besides being disenfranchised, which Brian and I were talking before was the issue that got him focused on felons, and especially when we think about, focus on jury service. Again, something that I think too many people look forward to avoiding, right? Who might say, yeah, why should we be worried about the felons not being able to be on juries? Who would want to be on juries? Lucky them. Where can I sign up to be a felon? The story, both as a matter of history and as a matter of our own conception of ourselves and our society, deserves some second thoughts. And without further ado, I want Brian to be able to tell us his first and second thoughts on these issues and give everybody else a time, but not only because I know I can show up to the faculty meeting late without missing much. I'm going to stick around as long as I can and apologize in advance, but if you're interested in any of these issues, whether it's juries or felons, come talk to me, but follow up with Brian, and just to thank you all for being here. Thank you.
I'll give a quick introduction before we get started. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. I'll forego the explanations of what this is. It's a speech with commentary. We've had plenty of these, so there's no real need to explain the format. Just before we get started today, I just want to welcome you guys all for coming out. The discussion, of course, is called Ex-Felons and Jury Service. I'll give a brief biography of Professor Kalt before we get started. Before becoming a professor at Michigan State, Professor Kalt worked at the D.C. office of Sidley and Austin. It's one of the top appellate law practices in the nation. He earned his J.D. from Yale Law School, where he was an editor at the Yale Law Journal. After law school, he served as a law clerk for the Honorable Danny Boggs, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Professor Kalt's research focus mainly focuses on structural constitutional law and juries. And at NSU, he teaches con law, torts, and administrative law. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Kalt.
Thanks. It's great to be here. You might have been wondering why the Federalist Society is bringing someone to speak to you about, of all things, why the problem with this country is that our juries don't have enough felons on them. And that's not quite my point. It sort of is, but really this is about probing what our jury system is really about, and what our criminal justice system is really about, and how if we question some easy assumptions, it's easy to just assume, well, yeah, felons, they shouldn't be on juries, but if you probe that, you can learn a lot. Probing those sorts of assumptions that the establishment sort of presents us with is, I think, something that the Federalist Society is all about. First, I'll talk briefly about the numbers involved here, then about the justifications for felon juror bans and why I think they don't stand up to much scrutiny, then more generally about the jury system, the criminal justice system, and how banning felons from jury service conflicts with the principles underlying them. And then I'll talk about what I think should be done, which is, I'm saying, last and least, what I think should be done. That and $4 will get you a cup of coffee. So the majority rule in this country, 30 states, including Ohio, and the federal government say, once you're convicted of a felony, you can't serve on a jury for the rest of your life, or after that, for that matter. And the net effect of this is to take over 13 million people out of the jury pool, about 6.5% of the adult population. For those interested in racial disparities, that includes at least 30% of the adult black men in this country. I'm interested in the racial disparity mainly for historical reasons, which I don't really have time to get into, but I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A if anyone wants to. Suffice it to say that 30% is a lot for something that can't necessarily be otherwise justified. Now, you hear a lot about felon disenfranchisement, people not being able to vote. It seems like the New York Times runs an editorial about that every few months. What they don't mention is that there are only 2 states left that ban you from voting for life versus 30 that ban you from jury service for life. And yet they're still harping on them. They don't talk about juries. And one of the reasons is because people don't really care about juries. They should, but they don't. That's been a recurring theme of my scholarship. People don't care about juries, and that can lead you into all sorts of interesting places. Because people don't care about juries, as I wrote in another article, there's a 50-square-mile swath of Idaho where you can commit crimes with impunity because of an oversight by Congress. But that's a talk for another day. Now, many of these people would be disqualified even if they weren't felons. Right? Some of them aren't citizens, some of them are illiterate, some of them are currently incarcerated, but there are plenty of millions left who would otherwise be available. And a lot of people want to argue that this is not constitutional, like banning people from voting because they're felons. They say it's not constitutional, neither is this. I disagree. Under current doctrine, it's pretty clear to me that it's not a constitutional problem to ban felons from jury service. There really isn't much of a constitutional right for anyone in particular to be on, well, there's no right to be on a jury, a particular jury, but there's no right to be in the jury pool. If you're going to be excluded from the jury pool because of membership in a group, well, maybe then you can make an equal protection argument, but as equal protection suspect classifications go, felons tend not to receive the benefit of much scrutiny. They just get rational basis, if that. Which is the easiest burden to satisfy. It is easy to satisfy, so typically in the rare cases where anyone's tried to litigate this, the states will satisfy rational basis by saying 2 things. 1, having felons on the jury degrades their moral standing, what the states call the probity of the jury. 2nd, felons, they say, are inherently biased against the government. And the one thing that the Constitution clearly does require is an impartial jury. These justifications are enough to satisfy the constitutional burden, but that's not saying much. And it's worth considering that the opposite is true too. That is, there are 20 states where felons aren't banned for life from juries. And that has not been successfully attacked on constitutional grounds either. So the bar is so low that it can be cleared either way. States can ban felons because felons inherently taint the jury and they're so biased against the government. On the other hand, they can allow felons on juries because they don't inherently taint the jury or be inherently biased against the government. Since the law allows us either path, that just leaves us with policy arguments, right? The states can do whatever they want. What should they do? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the probity of the jury. How is it that felons threaten the moral probity, the moral purity of the jury? Well, maybe it's because they tend to be horrible people, right? Well, you know, some of them are. Many of them are, many of them aren't. I'll talk about the rest of the population in a minute, but as one proponent of banning felons put it, if someone is not responsible enough to follow the law, how can they be responsible enough to decide guilt or innocence? It's a fair question. And personally, I don't doubt that most felons are bad people. But are all of them bad? Are all of them that bad for the rest of their lives? Is someone who committed a nonviolent drug offense 40 years ago, or Professor Berman's drunk driver, or the guy who poisoned the lobsters, 40 years ago, got probation, really going to ruin the moral purity of the jury system if he sits on a jury on a slip and fall case? I don't think so. And if all felons are that bad, what about other bad people? Misdemeanors, juvenile offenders, or my favorite category, people who break the law but aren't caught, prosecuted, and convicted. Just to take one example, 40% of adult Americans admit to using illegal drugs. If they're not responsible enough to follow the law, how can they be responsible? Well, you see where I'm going with that. Think of